it's an opportunity for you to ask questions that you didn't have an opportunity to ask, but also to think more synthetically, I guess, and analytically, and to try to put papers together and pull out common themes. So I'm going to take advantage of my position in front of the microphone to ask a sort of opening question that asks the panelists to maybe think around a collective problem, because I was quite struck at the integrity of the panels and the way that they kind of cohered around common questions, but also sort of different approaches. And I was thinking in the first panel, obviously the voice was a recurrent theme, and yet precisely because of the importance of Plato, there was a sense that the voice was a kind of an opportunity to think a corporeality or a vitality or a kind of organic life point that nevertheless sort of wasn't taken up by Plato. And so thinking in Michael's paper that where you do have the temporalization of the body, it becomes in the place of a music that's cyclical or circular, that never has the kind of unfolding or linearity of an organic life. I was thinking in Ramona's paper that the way in which we were talking about that daimonic that erupts in Socrates, but one of the things that really struck me was the singularity of that moment, that in a way you have the voice, because there's no city and no parents to sort of care for Socrates and sort of usher him into this ethical world, but that Socrates then becomes the father to other citizens, thereby sort of not making it possible for them to have their own voices. And the father in sort of later Plato becomes the state, and the state becomes sort of more and more oppressive as the place where you're going to sort of become the other to the individual and usher them into ethical life, so that that daimonic moment and that voice moment in Socrates is progressively institutionalized, so that even there I think it's a kind of lost moment, or a point where the voice is sort of something you could take up but that you don't. And certainly also in Kristin's paper that Plato becomes, because of the body-soul dualism, the voice is again problematized in a way that Homer is not. And then to kind of, so there's a way in which this vital organic life is othered and problematized because of the place of Plato. In the second panel, what struck me was that there was a kind of a much more affirmative relationship to a notion of whether it's immanence or eros, or a kind of the life and the kind of natality that Miriam's paper was bringing out, as especially a sort of not just the negated other, but as an opportunity for thinking forms of sociality and collectivity and sort of co-vitality or symbiosis. And particularly going back to Rebecca's paper, I mean, that question that I was asking about what is the kind of the whole. So we could say, well, we don't want a whole, but then, you know, I realized the question becomes, how do we become durational together? Where is the point of meeting? And so the question that I wanted to pose to the panel as a whole was, if indeed the biopolitical has been sort of colonized as a term and really seen in negative light through Agamben and Foucault and afterwards, is there a way in which we might recuperate the notion of the biopolitical, where in each of these papers there's a sense in which a bios might be recuperated for a collective life that is political in a way that's affirmative or aspirational or optimistic? So that was the question I sort of wanted to pose to the panel as a whole, and then we can open it up to the group. Does anyone want to start? Giulia.
Well, I seize the occasion of, you know, for just a thought that accompanies me every day, just reading the New York Times in the morning, which is that precisely the biopolitical. I think that when Foucault started to work on this liberal modernity, which in the French context was not an obvious thing to talk about at the time, And when he started to say, we have to understand that this kind of politics has to be seen in its fundamental intent, which is to deal with bodies. I'm not sure that he had in mind only and exclusively these lines of demarcation that create exclusion, that creates precisely hospitals or prisons or psychiatrics, parkings for people. I think he really wanted to be able to think the creativity of the idea. And for me, the positivity of the biopolitical, so this duration together, is embodied, first of all, in the systems of welfare. I know that this seems bizarre, but I don't see a better illustration of a positive biopolitical that should be defended on behalf, precisely, of that language in the Affordable Care Act. I think that I'm not joking, I think that in the discussion today on precisely this politics of health and policies about health, that language should be the language where should emerge a way of thinking the body, our mortality, our fragility, the probability of being sick, the certainty of being sick, and the absolute certainty of dying someday. I think that should be the place where the positive side of this discourse flourishes.
I think that's a great constructive example, but I think the way it relates a little bit to what I was talking about was in that example, it's still about the fragility of life in a sense, and the worry
Yes.
the worry then becomes
Absolutely.
that the politics is based precisely on this idea of the fragility of life, and it becomes in what Brooke was talking to me about. I was thinking about how in my two quotations from Freud, in the first one you have the germ cells which are acting, as Brooke pointed out, in some senses in a social way, through sexual instincts being something that brings you into common with others, but then very soon they become the kind of narcissistic principle. And it's really trying to think about how you can think, the life instinct as something which is sociable, which doesn't get recuperated within a form of narcissism and a form of reassertion of the subject. And so, the precarity of life, that is where it's sort of easy to start thinking about communality, and that's where that's tended to be the sort of political movement in opposition to precisely a kind of idea of exactly in a sort of structure that you've been talking about, rather than seeing it as being against a biopolitical model which is constraining and so on.
Which is constraining. No, it's precisely, in a sense, it seems to me that at the beginning Foucault was exactly interested in that, not in the no, but in how you shape these modern individuals through education, through hygiene, through norms. So it seems to me that, especially in the United States, Foucault is really being taken as the theorist of resistance, whereas, I don't know, I tend to see him as someone who has tried to think about the profound ambivalence and the shaping aspect of precisely redistributing, drawing lines, and placing the body and life in its fragility at the forefront. So I have an optimistic Foucault in mind.
And I wonder whether, I mean, I'll just say one very small thing. I mean, in that productive encounter between this kind of optimistic Foucault, but also the critique of, mortalist humanism, but there might be a way in finitude or immortality to precisely open up to this kind of natality. I mean, I think that's the challenge, that natality is not just the polar opposite of mortality, and so we're going to just sort of correct and we're going to go back to birth, and we're not going to think about death, but that we might actually think about mortality. I mean, the way in which, thinking about this collective conversation, as a political conversation about, even something as sort of both blunt and crucially important as end of life is actually reorienting the conversation about end of life, where it's not about biopolitical control of bodies in nursing homes, but about the kind of moment where people say, what is most important to me in my life, that I actually think about, this is how I want to live my death, that becomes a political conversation. It could be that kind of opportunity where natality and mortality actually intersect, as opposed to seeing them as somehow antithetical to one another.
Yeah, and also all the philosophy and the theory of care, which is so important. I think it's part of that for me, in that duration together you were talking about.
Do other panelists?
It's funny that
I know other people want to speak too, but other panelists want to respond. Michael, did you?
It's interesting that Foucault's coming into the conversation now where he hasn't necessarily before. But I think in one of the couple of late interviews, he talks about a threefold process of resistance, curiosity, innovation. Resistance to disciplinary powers of various kinds, curiosity for different ways of thinking and seeing, and then innovation in terms of our practices. And it's that innovation that brings him to begin talking about various techniques of the self, techniques of the care of the self. So I think we're very interesting the way in which you began with the rethinking things in a Foucaultian way in relationship to the Affordable Care Act and so forth. It would be interesting to bring Foucault's readings of Plato back on the table, since he has some very interesting and it seems to me problematic ones, but it would be it's another question.
Oh, you're asking, should I move this? You're asking about the biopolitical, and I'm thinking that we are talking about posthumanism, and I'm interested in making the borders fluid, not only between what is human and an animal or divine, but maybe beyond life or beyond bios. And we live in an age where the question of fragility also concerns what goes beyond life. We live in an age with the fragility of the earth, of the climate, of the changes that affect life, but beyond life. And then I'm thinking that a move towards the ontological and rethinking our basic assumptions at an ontological level might be really necessary. And I think that Rebecca, in her paper on time and kinesis, is heading in that direction. And so, in a way, I think a part of the answer to the question about the biopolitical is to move to the ontological questions of, for instance, time.
So I was very struck in your turn to Ovid toward the end of your paper with what sounded to me, and I wonder if you would agree with this characterization, as a distinction between the talk about bodies that you were cataloging with Kant and Nussbaum, as opposed to a talk about embodiment in Ovid. And the question that you posed, I think, is really beautifully put. The question was, what about the gesture? And it struck me that that gesture is a very interesting trope to think about, precisely that reciprocal relation, right? Because gestures are movements of the body that have meaning insofar as they are interpretable within a kind of collection of meaning-invested motions. And that struck me as a very interesting way to pose the question of sociality or of politics or of biopolitics in the following way, that the kind of focus on bodies that we get from something like Kant or Nussbaum is a focus on discrete entities and not a kind of dynamic relation between them, and a focus on entities that have meaning imposed on them as opposed to entities that generate meaning. And so consequently produce in us an impoverished vocabulary for gesture. And it sounded to me like you were in part calling for a kind of cultivation of a more sophisticated erotics of gesture that I think is quite provocative and interesting. But to take this notion of the gesture as a way of getting at meaning, the meaning of embodiment or the meanings of embodiment seems like something that might be of interest to others on the panel as well, insofar as, again, there is this kind of collective investment of meaning that makes the gesture a gesture. So in thinking then of Foucault, right, if I understood it correctly, but in part biopolitics emerges for him precisely as a way of analyzing populations, not individuals. So there again, the need is, or the effort is to point to an impoverished vocabulary for contending with our collective lives or the way that we live together. And so it seems like a number of you might have something to say about that need and how we might go about cultivating such a vocabulary, drawing from ancient thinkers. So I just throw that out there.
I don't know if there are perhaps others who would like to go. If not, yes, I think that gestures, movements, and manners are something that puts those bodies in motion and in relations. And absolutely, it's about embodiment. It's about experience. It's about again, what Merleau-Ponty draws attention to, which is when I touch, I feel the thing that I touch, but I also feel my hands touching. And so he goes on this knowledge that comes from the touching behind the lamp. And therefore, I think that all this also new attention for the senses and synesthesia project that Shane Butler had started at UCLA, and now this has taken the shape of collective books, etc. It really contributes to this perspective. Rediscover the senses, the plurality of the senses, and the moment you discover the plurality of the senses, the body as an ontological category opposed to the person just falls apart. It's not there any longer. And as a very brief footnote, what I would like to add is that the Roman law is behind, actually, this first genealogy that takes us to Kant, because the distinction, as you know, between persons and objects is crucial for the foundations of Roman law. And the latest book by Roberto Esposito happens to be precisely on persons and things, and he tries to show how the template of the Roman law on persons and things has to be seen behind all this philosophical thinking. So I found myself somehow meeting by chance with this thinking by Esposito, who perhaps he's becoming more interesting than Agamben in terms of, this constellation of people. But yes, thank you for your way of amplifying what I was trying to say. Thanks, certainly.
So I have Emma, Mark, Pauline, Adriana, and Claudia. So maybe if you're the next person in line, you could move up here so then we can not lose time.
That sounds good. In terms of this theme that's come up a couple of times in relation to the narcissism of the germ cell and it's kind of moving out towards sociality and so on, I just wanted to bring Empedocles to the table. Because we've had Eros and Thanatos, and we've had Apollo and Dionysus, and I thought we could have Philia and Nacus as well. And fragment 348, he says, "A twofold tale I shall tell. At one time they grew to be one alone out of many. At another, again, they grew apart to be many out of one. Double is the birth of mortal things, and double their failing. For the one is brought to birth and destroyed by the coming together of all things. The other is nurtured and flies apart as they grow apart again. And these things never cease their continual interchange, now through love, all coming together into one, now again each carried apart by the hatred of strife. So insofar as they have learned to grow one from many, and again as the one grows apart, grow many, thus far do they come into being and have no stable life, but insofar as they never cease their continual interchange, thus far they exist always changeless in the cycle." So I guess that's a kind of structural or cyclical point. But then there's this other dimension that I was very struck by as well. I think in the relationship of Giulia's papers and Miriam's papers in terms of what Bataille, I just taught Bataille this week, so I'm sort of thinking about the sort of inner experience of Eros and its closeness to death as well. I mean, that's what, in erotism, his sensibility is that, the desire for, that sexual desire and the desire for death are infinitely close to one another. So that also strikes me as a masculinist proposition too, at least in the way that Bataille proposes it and articulates it. So I don't think I wanted to so much ask a question as just to sort of throw all that at the panel and see what you make of it. Thanks.
I want to pick that up. Maybe we let it percolate. Okay.
This here actually so they can see.
Okay. It's quite a specific question, I think, for Rebecca, just about non-being, maybe as the kind of, the sort of absolute threshold of the posthuman, and I guess my question is this: I mean, does the question of sort of the sort of apprehensibility of non-being, like, have the same form in thinking about, like, the here as it does in thinking about the now, right? And part of the reason I'm asking that question is I was just sort of struck by a sort of small fact about the kind of that formulation of the other and the other, right? I mean, with respect to time, as you were speaking about it, and that it has exactly that form in the sort of Heraclitean formulation of the here, right? I mean, in the river. The river fragment. It's exactly that. It's that what stops us. I mean, what stops us being able to get sort of apprehend the here, right? Is this kind of the sort of the presence of presence is the wrong word, but the place of non-being in this endless iteration of sort of other and other rivers. I mean, exactly the same formulation. So I'm just curious if you think that the form of the problem is the same with respect to the here as it is with respect to the now.
Okay, I find your question very interesting and difficult, and I'll do my best with it. And I haven't been thinking about the Heraclitean formulation that you just mentioned. I find, I mean, non-being, I did talk about non-being when I was talking about Derrida's discussion of the way in which the now is determined. So that the now in becoming temporal ceases to be, and that it's in that it is temporal, and therefore temporalization itself does not have being. In some ways, what I'm trying to do with thinking this idea of immanent time is almost not ask the question, it's try to think around, if this is possible, try to think around the idea of non-being. There is being, we don't know why there is being, but there is being, and being is other and other. That I find non-being is like a blockage to the possibility of thinking the durational rhythms. I suppose I could invoke Bergson here, actually. I mean, Bergson refuses to, like, for him, the non-being is, I don't know, he wouldn't say it's like the wrong question, but yeah. Well, he doesn't actually strictly, he doesn't speak of non-being. I think with this concept of immanence, there is sounds overly presentist, but there is being as difference as other and other, and I would like to think that non-being could be put out of play. Yeah, that's so. Yeah, that's the best I can do with your question.
Okay.
Thank
yeah,
you.
no, I just wondered about, the thought that kept coming to me was, well, what about if there's immanent time, what about immanent place? Right, which is on the face of it an absurd question, but in some sense I feel like that's the question. I mean, that's a question that one could ask in relation to Heraclitus.
I think that I think you could call it immanent place as well. I actually have spent a lot of time working on Aristotle's concept of topos, and especially in relation to erigere. And I think this idea of immanent time could be spoken of also as, let's say clumsily, like time, place. I mean, in later work, erigere talks about the interval, and she says the interval always remains in play as place, or the possibility of place. And I think in that formulation there is a weaving together of the distinctions between time and place in the traditionally metaphysical, let's say presentist sense, become non-pertinent, I think, in this weaving together of time and place together in immanence. Yeah. Thank you.
Could I yeah. Maybe just one word. When we commonly present the pre-Socratics, we present Heraclitus in relationship to Parmenides, and one could argue that Parmenides is giving us something like an immanent place. In other words, a way of being, an immanent place that is full, that has no outside, it has no interior pockets of non-being, and the way of non-being is unthinkable, it's unapproachable. And of course, Plato in the Sophists will try to rethink this in order to give a kind of hierarchy of being, by arguing that in a certain sense non-being is, and that's the break with Parmenides. But I think one way of thinking Parmenides in relationship to Heraclitus is precisely in terms of an immanent being, if you want to put it that way, an immanent here.
I have two questions that stem from mostly the first panel that we had this morning about the voice. The first one is addressed to the three of you, and we've heard a lot about the voice, but we've heard a lot less about listening and modes of listening. So given all the work that is being done on acoustics, on the senses, and on extending the realm of those, the auditory to things beyond the human, including listening to cells, I'm thinking of sonocytology, I'm wondering how you're integrating all this research, all this thinking into your own thinking about the voice and modes of listening, and then we can extend the question to the speakers of this afternoon. My second question, again, that stemmed from the three papers this morning, and that Miriam's paper, in a way, answered, is you all sort of located your papers outside something, and I'm wondering where the proper place to talk about the non-human, the object, the non-material is. Is it in myth? Is it in dialogue? Is it in fiction? What is the proper linguistic or fictional or rhetorical, or I don't even know how to call it, mode to address these questions that the ancients had? In a way, we see it in all of ancient literature, but is there a privileged place or a privileged mode or tone or sort of engagement with the reader that we can see that in?
So, well, I know, at least for me, you hit at the place that I discussed least, that needs to be most, and we talked about this already, needs to be taken care of most, which is the way I'm interested in is what is this particular mode of listening that Socrates has to a voice that is not present, and how does that differ from the types of listening he engages in with when he listens to poetry, when he listens to other people speaking, when he listens to the earth. And so that I think that one has to kind of typologize these different modalities of listening, which I haven't begun yet to do. And obviously we talked about listening to the cicadas. So there's that. And are you asking about a methodology of, when you ask about the privileged tone or engagement, is it about a methodology or?
No, it's more about genre. Ancient genres of addressing the questions, modes of writing, modes of asking the question, or modes of answering it that we get access to with our own methodology. But I'm interested more in the ancient practices and our methodology rather than the other way around. If that makes sense.
Well, I mean, again, just going back to Plato just very briefly and obviously, I mean, what's so interesting about his writing is how it crosses genres. So that I think even asking if there is a privileged genre is kind of Plato answered in saying that there isn't, that it's many different genres, and this is Nightingale's work is really interesting, that are in conversation with each other. And I think he tried very hard to break down that type of privileging of a specific type of genre.
I'm not really sure how to answer your question. You're asking about what we could find if we turn to the ancient Greeks, in my case, in terms of the notion of listening. And I think I will answer you in two ways. First, what immediately comes to mind to me in relation to Plato is, for instance, in the Phaedrus, where one could read the story about the cicadas as a warning against a certain kind of listening, or the dangers of listening to music too much. But for myself, when it comes to the notion of listening, the one who has inspired me in thinking about listening is first and foremost Irigaray. And she talks about different kinds of listening. And I think that is very useful. She talks about a listening. You can listen to someone to get information, and you can listen to their emotions. But there is also another kind of listening that she proposes or argues vehemently in terms of an ethical attitude, and that is the listening to the irreducible aspect of the other, the strangeness, the foreignness, that which you cannot grasp or understand and get a hold of. And to me, this attitude that this kind of listening represents is a kind of an active form of passivity that destroys the active-passive opposition in an interesting way. And I also think it's really, really fruitful ethically to think this way in our age. And for me, going back to the pre-Socratics, going back to Homer, for instance, what is interesting to me, going back to Homer, is exactly trying to listen to the foreignness and the strangeness and that which I cannot grasp within the concepts of my own thinking, and trying to learn something from that. So, yeah, I don't think I'm answering your question, but...
Okay, just two more questions.
I want to make a suggestion on Kant and connect Kant with Plato. The erotic, according to Kant, together with many other drives, belong to a general category, which is the category of Neigung, inclination. And inclination is very dangerous for the subject because Kant constructs the subject as a vertical subject. Foucault tells us that the age of Kant, the 18th century, is the age of rectification, of verticalization. So, of course, Kant is very upset and very worried about the inclinations and the strong inclination like love, like eros, like the erotic. And the connection with Plato is the following. If we try to reconstruct a genealogy, not of the erotic, but a genealogy of the verticalization of the subject, we have at least to begin with Plato. Because in Plato, we have this famous, the myth of the cave, is just the narrative of a final verticalization, a verticalization of the subject. In a book of mine, I call it Philosophus erectus, not Homo erectus, but Philosophus erectus. A subject who is verticalized by truth itself. And I want to remember that this vertical subjectivity that we find already in Plato it is speechless. In the acme, in the final moment of noises, there is no voice, there is no materiality of the voice. It is contemplation, which is theory, literary, to contemplate in a speechless way. But in Plato, however, we can find another pattern, a different pattern. Unfortunately, it was not the winning pattern. The winning pattern of Platonism was the verticalization. But we can find a different pattern, a different model, which is an erotic model, a model in which the inclination wins, the inclination, the attraction, because of course the inclined person is bending outside himself. So it is totally unbalanced, and it is attracted by the object of eros. And we find also, of course, you know, I'm just in mind the Phaedrus and the Symposium and so on. And what I want to underline or to suggest, just this is one of my big passion about inclinations, the history of the concept of inclination. What I want to suggest is that if the Western tradition or the philosophical tradition had inherited this second Plato, this secondary Plato, it would have gone toward a very interesting subjectivity, a subjectivity made up of relationship, a relational subjectivity, On the other hand, the history of metaphysics is the history of different models of verticalization. So what I want to say is that there is a missing Plato, maybe a Plato who could sing, a Plato who was not going toward the speechless final moment, but could sing and could involve the other. Unfortunately, this was not the real story of metaphysics. Unfortunately, we had the modern individualistic ontology, and we had this terrible freak Kant, which was a bachelor, really a very freak.
Could I rebound just a second? I couldn't agree more, and also in resonance with what we heard this morning, if we look for lines of demarcation of the human vis-a-vis other living beings, I think that the verticality of the human body plays an immense role in Plato, as we all know, because the soul is located in at different floors, so to speak. So, okay. And I couldn't agree more that if we cut to the chase when we read Plato, if we cut to the metaphysical chase, if we go up Diotima's ladder, well, we come to the foundation of metaphysics. How about deciding that we stay at the ground floor, that we don't take the stair? I think that if Plato has written dialogues, is because he wanted us not to take that stair. So, you know, how about really, without going into the Tübingen theory of the esoteric works and the pedagogical dialogues, why not to take stock of this massive production of dialogues who restart all over again the same conversation on different topics with people physically present, struggling and being at the level of eros. So I couldn't agree more that there are two Platos, and that I would say we have the choice. We have the choice, because who says that you have to go to the contemplation of the neuter, to kalon, to agaton, and stay there? Anyway, not even the philosopher stays out of the cave. You go down again. So once we know how we speak, actually we are with eros in the relations, in the inclination, and I'm not sure that metaphysics has won. I think this is what historians or philosophers tell us, but I think that the sophists have won, and the poets have won. And this is why we are here, restarting again and again and again. So keep talking, in a sense. Let's keep talking.
I'll be brief. What's always struck me in the Republic are two things. One is that the different modes of sensation and knowing are described as pathos, so that there's already incorporated in this kind of erotic attachment to the world. And then the second thing, which I know you're aware of, is, and this connects with what you're saying, is I don't know if it's as much about not climbing the ladder, but what happens once you do climb the ladder, like he says, what happens to the philosopher, and then you have to come back. I mean, you have to come back and touch a human being after having had this experience of something else. So then how do you re-experience the particular after once having become speechless and overtaken by that which is completely abstract? And I'm very, and this is the, yeah.
The one who comes back is Socrates. Plato doesn't come back.
No, but
He doesn't go down between the human, among the human effect. Doesn't come.
But he reads dialogue.
But he writes dialogues, and I'd say even more that what he has to write when you ask he's speechless is that I think you give a beautiful way of formulating why the myths are there. That the myths at the end of certain dialogues are responses to that speechlessness.
Okay, we started a little late, so one last question, Claudia Baracchi, and then we'll have a break.
Thank you. Yeah, of course, it's very complicated for me now because Adriana has raised an issue that is very, very dear and urgent to me, so I will not even begin on that one. But I agree with this suggestion, and if what you, Giulia, have said is true, then a further question is being raised that was floating around for me already in the morning, namely the question of the responsibility for our interpretation. Because if it is true, as you said, that we have a choice, because the other Plato is just as conspicuous, then it becomes very interesting to see the way in which we are in play as we take certain directions and orientations rather than others. But I will leave this aside because also I think I will come back to it in a moment in the talk. But first of all, I really wanted to thank all of you because it's been an incredibly rich morning and afternoon. I would like to ask a very specific question, which probably resonates with the rest of the talks, though. And again, it's for Rebecca. Because, of course, I thought, it was a formidably subtle treatment of the question of immanence, and I thought this liberating reading of Aristotle was very brilliant, I thought. However, I was struck, of course, not only in you, but also in the literature you're referring to, by your insistence on this term, that time in a certain kind of Aristotelian interpretation is subjected to motion, right? Now, this, which you call subjection, is actually a very interesting phenomenon, right? Because it has to do with another kind of immanence that doesn't have anything to do with interiority, but it has to do with the physicality of events and the fact that time is not inner sense. Time is of the world, is of phenomena, is of becoming, and there is no time without becoming. And so this inherence of time in phenomena could be developed in very interesting ways, aside from calling it a subjection. I mean, I could see why you wanted to go the other direction, given your interest for the immanence as you developed it by reference to Irigaray. But here I would think in particular of the Timaeus, of course, where it's probably this stark contrast with what time becomes after Augustine. Namely, in the Timaeus, we really, and I think Aristotle is still within the sphere of Plato's Timaeus, we really have time that belongs to the world, that belongs to the sky, that belongs to the system of sky and earth as the living body of becoming. And there is no time outside and aside from that. This strikes me as an interesting route to go in terms of exploring another kind of transcendence, which is not a transcendence that takes us away from the phenomenon, but it's a transcendence that remains inside the phenomenon. It's a horizontal transcendence, but not limited to the anthropological, limited to the human. It's really towards the materiality of the environment, of that which envelops us, again, to go back to Merleau-Ponty. And I think that this direction would give us one possible suggestion, among many to be sure, but one possible suggestion about what it might mean to begin to think in terms of perceptual refinement, perceptual education, if we want, a kind of deepening and refinement and cultivation of our sensory capability. I will stop here because the connections could be many, but of course this also has to do with other really, I think, extremely provocative ways of reading Antiquity that have everything to do with the horizon that the organizers have proposed for us today and tomorrow, namely the question of how there are certain dimensions of the ancient discourse that are really ripe, pregnant with future, with the yet to come, really. So I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much for that. I don't think I can answer you in some ways because you have traversed so many complex points. And I don't feel on top of the Timaeus enough to speak about that very specifically. But the claim that time is subjected to motion, and the word subjected actually, I was really, I suppose, subordinated to motion would be a better way to put it. And I was thinking in terms of the way that time is used as the measure of motion in Aristotle. So I guess he's one of the renderings of Chronos, and by no means the most interesting, is the one where he says that Chronos is the number of motion. So it's that particularly that I'm protesting. And you have gone to the heart of something that I think I need to think more about. But the kinesis, especially when I made the move to Bergson, I actually think that Bergson's concept of duration owes a great deal to an Aristotelian conception of kinesis. Its inherence in you're talking about time's inherence in phenomena, in physical phenomena, and that there is no time outside of this for Aristotle and as for Plato. I think one of the other texts that I haven't mentioned in the paper explicitly at all is one of the other people I've been thinking about a lot in relation to this work is Deleuze. And I think in Deleuze there is a concept of time that is not, he would disagree with you that there is no time outside of this time of, let's say, of the world. And he argues for a thinking of a pure form of time that is not, that I think for him precedes and exceeds the thinking of time through phenomena. As to my own position, I'm still not sure myself. I'm very drawn to the Deleuzian, I am very drawn to the Deleuzian position on this. I guess because I suppose I see this idea of imminent time as constitutive of the living body of becoming that we might call a world. And I don't know, that's the best I can do with your question. Thank you very much.
Okay, so from a much more banal sense of time, I think we should wrap up there. But first, let's thank our panelists again for the wonderful papers and discussion.